August 7th, 1945. 0815 hours. Outskirts of Hiroshima, Japan. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto crouched beside his motorcycle at the checkpoint, staring at what had once been the horizon. Where Hiroshima should have been, there was only a flat expanse of gray dust and twisted metal, broken by the occasional skeletal remains of what might have been buildings. The morning sun, which should have been warming his face, felt cold against skin that suddenly understood it was looking at the end of the world. 24 hours earlier, Yamamoto had been preparing reports at his garrison 15 kilometers outside the city. Then came the flash that turned the western sky white as noon, followed by a rumble that shook the earth like the footsteps of giants. Communications with Hiroshima had ceased instantly. Not gradually, not with reports of damage and casualty estimates, just silence. Now, as the first member of the Imperial Japanese Army's emergency response team, authorized to enter the devastated city, Yamamoto faced a landscape that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare, about destruction, about the very nature of what human beings could do to each other. What he would discover in the next 12 hours would be classified by the Japanese government for 40 years. His official report would be buried so deep that even the American occupation forces never found it. And the photographs he would take with his military camera would be hidden until long after everyone who remembered that day was dead. But first, he had to understand what he was looking at. August 6th, 1945. 0815 hours. T-0. To understand what Lieutenant Yamamoto found, you must first understand what had been lost. Hiroshima at 8:14 a.m. on August 6, 1945. Was a living city of 350,000 people going about their morning routines. Children walked to school in the humid summer heat. Workers hurried to factories producing materials for a war effort that Japan's leaders knew was failing but refused to abandon. Housewives hung laundry in courtyards where flowers still bloomed despite wartime rationing. At 8:15 a.m., the Enola Gay released Little Boy, a uranium-235 nuclear device containing the explosive equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT, over the center of the city. The bomb detonated 1,900 feet above ground level, creating a fireball that reached temperatures of 3,000 degrees Celsius at its center. In the first seconds after detonation, the thermal radiation vaporized everything within a half-mile radius of ground zero. Human beings simply ceased to exist, leaving only shadows burned into concrete where their bodies had briefly shielded surfaces from the intense heat. Buildings designed to withstand earthquakes crumbled like paper models. The blast wave, traveling at nearly the speed of sound, flattened everything in a 2-mile radius. By 8:16 a.m., Hiroshima had been deleted from the map. But deletion, Yamamoto would discover, was only the beginning. What happened next would prove more terrifying than the initial destruction, because it suggested that the weapon hadn't just destroyed a city. It had poisoned the very air, water, and earth in ways that defied traditional understanding of warfare. August 7th, 1945. 0830 hours. First entry. Yamamoto rode his motorcycle slowly into what had been Hiroshima's outer districts, following roads that were barely recognizable beneath debris and ash. His orders were specific: conduct preliminary reconnaissance, establish communications if possible, and document conditions for the larger relief effort that would follow. Nothing had prepared him for the silence. In 20 years of military service, Yamamoto had seen bombed cities before. He had walked through the ruins of Chinese towns after artillery barrages, had surveyed Japanese cities after American firebombing raids. Devastated cities had sounds: the groans of weakened structures settling, the crackling of fires still burning, the calls of survivors trapped in rubble, the voices of rescue workers. Hiroshima was absolutely silent. Not the silence of a cemetery, which still has the sounds of wind and birds and life continuing around death. This was the silence of a place where life itself had been fundamentally interrupted. No birds sang because there were no birds. No insects buzzed because there were no insects. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the air itself had been damaged. Yamamoto stopped his motorcycle and walked the last kilometer into the city center, following what had been Aoi Bridge, the target the Enola Gay's bombardier had used to aim his bomb. The bridge's distinctive T-shape, visible from 31,000 feet, had made it perfect for precision bombing. Now it was a twisted sculpture of melted metal and concrete, its form so altered that Yamamoto needed his map to confirm he was looking at what had once been a major landmark. The first bodies he encountered challenged his understanding of human mortality. Traditional warfare created recognizable corpses. Bullets and shrapnel left wounds that could be examined and understood. Fire and explosives damaged the body, but left something recognizably human for burial and mourning. The atomic bomb had created something entirely different. Some victims had been vaporized completely, leaving only their shadows permanently burned into walls and pavement, dark silhouettes showing where human beings had stood at the moment of detonation. A man sitting on stone steps, a child reaching for something, a woman pushing a cart. They existed now only as photographic negatives etched into the city's surfaces, their bodies transformed into light and heat in a fraction of a second. Other bodies showed the effects of thermal radiation in ways that Yamamoto's military medical training couldn't explain. Burns that seemed to have cooked people from the inside out, clothing that had burned away while skin remained intact, eyes that had melted while leaving faces otherwise unmarked. The patterns of destruction seemed to follow no logic that conventional warfare could explain. But it was the survivors who would haunt Yamamoto's dreams for the rest of his life. August 7th, 1945. 1,000 hours. The Walking Dead. In a damaged school building that had partially survived the blast, Yamamoto found approximately 40 people who were technically alive but should not have been. They moved slowly through the rubble, performing tasks that seemed to have no purpose, sorting through burned debris, arranging broken objects in neat piles, walking in circles around areas where buildings had once stood. Their injuries defied medical explanation. Burns that seemed to be healing and spreading simultaneously. Hair that had fallen out in perfect patterns, leaving geometric designs on scalps. Skin that appeared normal in some light but showed severe radiation damage in others, as if they were slowly transforming from living people into something else entirely. When Yamamoto tried to speak with them, their responses suggested that the bomb had damaged more than their bodies. They spoke in fragmentary sentences about events that hadn't happened, people who weren't there, conversations taking place in locations that no longer existed. A woman described preparing breakfast for her family, not seeming to notice that her family had been vaporized and her kitchen was now a crater. A man explained that he was late for work at a factory that had been reduced to a foundation of melted metal. Most disturbing were the children. Yamamoto found a group of school children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, sitting in neat rows in what had been their classroom. The school's walls were gone, the roof had collapsed, and the teacher's desk was a pool of melted wood and metal. But the children sat in perfect formation, facing forward, apparently attending a lesson being delivered by a teacher who wasn't there. When Yamamoto approached them, they looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through him, rather than at him. One little girl raised her hand and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Sensei, when will our families come to take us home?" Behind her, Yamamoto could see the shadows of other children burned into the wall. Shadows of classmates who had been sitting in the same positions when the bomb detonated. The surviving children were sitting among the shadows of the dead, waiting for a lesson to continue in a classroom that no longer existed, taught by a teacher who had been vaporized 24 hours earlier. Yamamoto took photographs. Though his hands shook so badly he doubted the images would be usable. He made notes in his field journal, though he struggled to find words for what he was documenting. How do you describe people who are alive but not living, who are dying but not dead, who continue their daily routines in a world that has ceased to exist? August 7th, 1945. 1200 hours. At the exact center of the blast zone, Yamamoto found something that would be classified by both the Japanese government and, later, American occupation forces. Something that suggested the atomic bomb had done more than destroy a city. It had torn a hole in reality itself. The epicenter of the blast was marked by what appeared to be a perfectly circular area, approximately 50 meters in diameter, where the destruction followed different rules. Within this circle, some objects that should have been vaporized remained intact, while others that should have survived were completely destroyed. A wooden fence post stood unburned next to a pile of melted steel. A paper document lay uncharred beside a human shadow burned so deeply into concrete that it looked carved. More troubling were the temporal anomalies. Yamamoto's military issue watch, which had been keeping perfect time, began running backward when he entered the circle. The temperature, which should have been elevated due to residual heat from the blast, dropped suddenly to near freezing. His camera, which had been functioning normally, began taking photographs of things that weren't visible to the naked eye, images that would later show scenes from before the bombing overlaid on the current destruction. In his field notes, Yamamoto wrote, "The laws of physics appear to function differently within the blast center. It is as though the weapon has damaged not just matter, but the fundamental structure of space and time. I observe effects that my training cannot explain, and phenomena that should not be possible." At the exact center of the circle stood what remained of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, the building now known as the Atomic Bomb Dome. The structure had been only 160 meters from the bomb's detonation point, yet its steel frame had survived while more distant and supposedly stronger buildings had been completely destroyed. But it wasn't the building's survival that disturbed Yamamoto. It was what he found inside. The interior of the building had been transformed into something that resembled a vast camera obscura. Images from the moment of detonation were somehow burned into the walls and ceiling, not shadows, but actual photographic images showing the last seconds of the city's life in perfect detail. Yamamoto could see people on the streets at the moment of the flash, their faces turned upward toward a light that would kill them. He could see birds frozen in flight, their wings spread against a sky that was beginning to burn. Most disturbing were the images that showed events from after the bombing. Pictures of rescue workers who had not yet arrived, scenes of rebuilt structures that did not yet exist, and impossibly, photographs of himself taking photographs, creating an infinite recursive loop of documentation within documentation. August 7th, 1945, 1500 hours, the radiation sickness. By mid-afternoon, Yamamoto began experiencing symptoms that his military medical training had never covered. Nausea and dizziness he might have expected from witnessing such devastation, but other symptoms seemed to come from exposure to something that conventional warfare had never created. His vision began showing him things that weren't there, or perhaps things that had been there 24 hours earlier. Transparent figures walking through the rubble, going about their daily routines as if the city still existed. A ghostly trolley following its route, along tracks that had been melted into twisted metal. Children playing in parks that were now craters, their laughter audible but echoing strangely as if coming from a great distance. His notebook entries became increasingly incoherent as the day progressed. 15:30 hours. Found family of 4 sitting at dinner table that no longer exists. They invited me to join them. Table was set for 5. 1600 hours. Photographed woman hanging laundry. Laundry appears normal in camera viewfinder but does not exist when viewed directly. 16:30 hours. Radio playing music from station that was destroyed. Music sounds like it's coming from underground. The radiation sickness was affecting not just his body, but his perception of reality itself. The bomb had created a form of poison that attacked the mind's ability to distinguish between what was real and what was memory, between what existed and what had been destroyed, between the living and the dead. August 7th, 1945, 1800 hours. The forbidden photographs. As evening approached, Yamamoto realized that his documentation of Hiroshima would never be allowed to reach the public. The images on his camera showed things that would be impossible to explain, phenomena that would challenge basic assumptions about the nature of reality, weapons effects that went far beyond simple destruction. He had photographed shadows of people burned into concrete with such intensity that they showed not just the outline of their bodies, but the expressions on their faces at the moment of vaporization. He had captured images of the temporal anomalies at ground zero, showing the same locations at different times simultaneously. Most damning, he had documented evidence that the atomic bomb's effects were continuing to spread, that the weapon had created a kind of infection in reality itself that was slowly expanding outward from the blast center. In his final coherent journal entry, Yamamoto wrote, "This weapon does not simply destroy. It corrupts. It poisons, not just the body, but the fundamental structure of existence itself. The Americans have created something that damages reality at its most basic level. This knowledge cannot be allowed to spread, for it would cause more panic than the bomb itself. Better that the world believe this was simply a very large explosive than understand that it has torn holes in the fabric of space and time. August 7, 1945. 2000 hours. The order to withdraw. Yamamoto's radio crackled to life with orders from his commanding officer: abort reconnaissance. Return to base immediately. Do not discuss observations with anyone. All documentation to be classified at highest level. Later investigation would reveal that similar orders were being given to rescue workers throughout the region. The Japanese government had realized within hours that the atomic bomb's effects were far more complex and disturbing than simple destruction. Reports from the first responders described phenomena that could not be explained by conventional physics and survivors displaying symptoms that had no medical precedent. The decision was made to classify all first-hand accounts until the government could understand what they were dealing with. Unfortunately for the Japanese authorities, they would never understand what they were dealing with, because the atomic bomb had created effects that were literally unprecedented in human history. August 8, 1945. 0600 hours. The cover-up begins. When Yamamoto returned to his garrison, his commanding officer confiscated his camera, his notes, and his official report. He was debriefed by military intelligence officers who asked very specific questions about temporal anomalies, radiation effects on perception, and whether he had observed any evidence that the bomb's effects were continuing to spread. When he answered honestly, yes, he had observed all of these things, he was informed that his mission had been reclassified as a state secret. He would receive a promotion and a transfer to a distant posting. His family would be relocated. His identity would be changed. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto would cease to exist, and the man who replaced him would never speak of what he had seen in Hiroshima. The photographs were destroyed. The notes were burned. The official reports were buried in archives so deep that even the American occupation forces, when they arrived weeks later, never found them. But destroying documentation could not undo what had been seen, and transferring witnesses could not erase what they had learned about the true nature of atomic weapons. August 15, 1945. Imperial surrender. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb that had endurable effects. History would record this as referring to the unprecedented destructive power of atomic weapons. But military officials who had read the classified reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki knew he was referring to something more disturbing. The atomic bombs hadn't just destroyed two cities. They had damaged the fundamental structure of reality in localized areas, creating zones where the normal laws of physics operated differently, where time moved irregularly, where the boundary between the living and the dead had been permanently disrupted. The decision to surrender wasn't based solely on fear of continued atomic attacks. It was based on the terrifying realization that atomic weapons created effects that could not be controlled, contained, or understood, effects that might continue spreading long after the explosions themselves were over. 1985. Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. 40 years after the bombing, an elderly Japanese man approached the museum's archives with a metal box containing photographs and documents. He identified himself only as a former military officer who had been present in Hiroshima on August 7, 1945. The materials he donated were unlike anything the museum had ever received. The photographs showed images that didn't match any known documentation of the bombing's aftermath. Temporal anomalies, radiation effects that seemed to bend reality itself, survivors who were alive but existed in some state between life and death, evidence that the atomic bomb had created phenomena far beyond simple destruction. The museum staff examined the materials carefully. The photographs were authentic. The paper, the chemical processes, the camera equipment, all dated to 1945. The handwriting in the journals matched that of military personnel from the period. The technical details were consistent with actual conditions in Hiroshima after the bombing. But the content was impossible. The phenomena described couldn't have happened. The effects documented violated known laws of physics. The images showed things that simply could not exist. The museum's director made the decision to quietly archive the materials without public display. Some knowledge, he determined, was too disturbing to share. Some truths about atomic weapons were better left buried because they suggested that nuclear war might damage more than cities and lives. It might damage reality itself. Present day. Classified archives. The materials donated to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum remain in classified storage, accessible only to researchers with special government clearance. Similar archives exist in Tokyo, Washington, and Moscow, collections of documentation from the early atomic age that describe effects too disturbing for public knowledge. The truth about what Lieutenant Yamamoto found in Hiroshima on August 7, 1945, remains buried beneath layers of classification and official denial. But occasionally researchers examining declassified documents from the period find references to anomalous effects and temporal disturbances and reality disruption in areas affected by nuclear weapons. These references are quickly reclassified. The documents disappear into deeper archives. The researchers are transferred to different projects or find their security clearances mysteriously revoked. Because some knowledge is too dangerous to share. Some truths about the weapons we've created are too terrifying to acknowledge. And some of the effects of atomic bombs continue to this day, in places where the boundary between destruction and transformation was permanently altered by temperatures that briefly matched the interior of the sun. In Hiroshima, the atomic bomb dome still stands as a memorial to the bombing's victims. Tourists photograph its skeleton of steel and concrete, a symbol of humanity's capacity for both destruction and resilience. The official story speaks of thermal radiation and blast effects, of tragedy and recovery, of lessons learned about the horrors of nuclear war. But sometimes, visitors report strange experiences near the dome. Cameras that malfunction in specific ways, taking photographs of things that aren't visible to the naked eye, watches that run backward for brief periods, voices speaking in Japanese, having conversations about morning routines and family dinners, echoing from spaces where nothing stands but empty air. These reports are dismissed as imagination, as emotional reactions to visiting such a significant historical site. The idea that atomic weapons might have effects beyond simple destruction is too disturbing to acknowledge officially. But the archives remain. The classified documents wait in their sealed files, and somewhere in those files lies Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto's real report about what he found in Hiroshima 24 hours after the atomic bomb. A report that suggests we still don't fully understand what those weapons actually do, or what they might continue doing in places where reality itself was damaged by the power of splitting atoms. The flash of light that ended 100,000 lives in an instant may have been only the beginning. What came after? What Lieutenant Yamamoto documented in those forbidden photographs suggests that atomic weapons don't just destroy cities. They damage the world itself in ways we're still too frightened to understand.